On the morning of my 33rd birthday, exactly 3 hours after sunrise, my husband laughed while signing our divorce papers and slid a check for $5,000 across the table, like he was tossing scraps to a stray dog. 10 minutes later, he told me I had exactly 2 hours to get out of his house before he and his new girlfriend came back to celebrate my replacement. If you have ever sacrificed everything for someone who later treated you like you were nothing, go ahead and hit like and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Because what happened next turned his victory into the worst mistake of his life. My name is Stella Morgan. I'm 33 years old, and the man sitting across from me had absolutely no idea he had just signed away the biggest fortune he would ever touch. The mediation room inside the Santa Clara courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and industrial carpet cleaner. Cold fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Across the heavy mahogany table sat Richard Caldwell, my husband of 7 years, and soon-to-be ex. At 35, Richard had just been promoted to partner at a fast-rising venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. He wore a charcoal Italian suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. His hair was styled perfectly. His watch alone could have paid my rent for a year. And yet the man looking at me like I was worthless had built that life on top of the sacrifices I made. Richard leaned back in his chair and tapped his expensive gold pen against the divorce paperwork. His lawyer sat quietly beside him, clearly uncomfortable. My side of the table had no lawyer. That detail seemed to amuse him. Finally, he opened his leather checkbook and scribbled something quickly. Then he tore the check out with a sharp rip and slid it across the table. The paper stopped right in front of my folded hands. $5,000. Richard smiled like he had just delivered a generous gift. Take it, Stella. His voice carried the smug confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Go rent yourself a tiny apartment somewhere and start over. You should actually be grateful. Most people with your job would never see that kind of money all at once. I looked down at the check. $5,000. 7 years of marriage, reduced to a number smaller than Richard's monthly wine budget. You're serious? I asked quietly. Richard laughed. Dead serious. You glued old books together in a basement archive for minimum wage. Let's not pretend you contributed anything financially to this marriage. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably again, but stayed silent. Richard leaned forward now, enjoying himself. Next week, my firm closes a $500 million funding round. Once that happens, my personal net worth is going to explode. And I'm not stupid enough to let someone like you try to claim a piece of it 10 years from now. Someone like me. I kept my expression neutral, but inside my mind, I remembered everything. When Richard was 27 and drowning in student loans. When he couldn't afford tuition for his Master of Finance program at Stanford. When we lived in a tiny one-bedroom apartment with broken heating. When I worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. Coffee shop at 5 in the morning. Bookstore in the afternoon. Data entry until midnight. I paid his tuition. I ironed his first cheap suits. I edited his graduate thesis. I packed his lunches while living on instant ramen. For 7 years, I quietly built the staircase he climbed. And now that he was standing at the top, he decided I was the dirt on his shoe. Look at you, Richard continued, gesturing toward my beige cardigan. 33 years old, and still pretending restoring dusty books is a career. You have no ambition. You bring zero value to my life or my brand. Brand. That word almost made me laugh, because Richard thought wealth meant designer suits and venture capital deals. He had absolutely no idea what real wealth looked like. But before I could respond, a loud laugh echoed from the back of the room. Jamal Harris, Richard's brother-in-law, 32 years old, self-proclaimed crypto genius, permanent parasite. Jamal stood up from the courtroom bench, wearing a bright red jacket and a huge gold watch that screamed fake luxury. Come on, Richard, stop negotiating with charity cases. He grinned at me like I was entertainment. Make her sign the paper so we can get lunch. My crypto nodes just spiked this morning, and I've got reservations at a Michelin restaurant. He glanced at my clothes with exaggerated disgust. Pretty sure they won't let thrift store queens through the door. I didn't even turn to look at him. Jamal had slept on our couch for months 2 years earlier when he couldn't pay rent. But temporary crypto profits had apparently erased that memory. Then the door opened again. High heels clicked across the hardwood floor, and Sienna Caldwell walked in. Well, technically, she wasn't Caldwell yet. But that clearly didn't matter to her. Sienna Parker, 28 years old, daughter of a powerful commercial bank executive, and the woman Richard had been sleeping with for the last 6 months. She walked straight past my chair and leaned down to kiss Richard in front of the mediator. "Am I late?" Richard grinned like a proud trophy owner. "Perfect timing. We're just finishing up the trash removal." Sienna finally looked at me. Her eyes slowly scanned my simple clothes. Her lip curled. "Oh, you're still here." Her voice carried pure condescension. "Richard said you're trying to get money out of this divorce. That's honestly embarrassing. He built his career himself. You were just there." My fingers tightened slightly under the table. Built it himself. I paid his tuition. But Sienna wasn't finished. She opened her designer purse and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. With 2 fingers, she flicked it into the air. The bill floated down and landed on top of Richard's $5,000 check. "Take that for a cab." She crossed her arms. "Sign the divorce papers and let the adults handle real money." The room went silent. Richard smirked. Jamal laughed loudly. Even the mediator looked uncomfortable. They were all waiting for me to cry, to scream, to throw the money back. Instead, I calmly picked up the $100 bill. I folded it once, then slipped it into my purse. That small action wiped the smirk off Richard's face. He suddenly looked uncertain. "Good," he said quickly, trying to recover his confidence. "Now sign the agreement." His lawyer pushed a thick document across the table. Divorce settlement. But attached to it was something else. A post-nuptial addendum. Richard leaned forward eagerly. "Let me summarize it so you understand. This document says you accept the $5,000 as a full settlement. But more importantly, there's a clause right here." He tapped the page. "Both parties permanently waive rights to any current or future undiscovered assets." Jamal clapped from the back. "Smart move. Protect the bag from leeches." Richard nodded proudly. "You see, Stella, once my $500 million deal closes, I'll be worth tens of millions. Women like you wait years and then try to take half. Not happening." Sienna wrapped her arms around him. "My dad's bank is backing his fund." She glared at me. "You're never touching a dollar of our future." I stared at the document. Future undiscovered assets. The clause was airtight. If Richard signed this, he would legally give up any claim to everything I owned. Everything. My inheritance. The trust. The global infrastructure empire. The trillion-dollar secret he had mocked just minutes earlier. My heart beat slowly. But not from fear. From excitement, because Richard thought he was building a wall to protect his money. In reality, he was locking himself out of mine. I picked up the pen, but before signing, I looked directly into his eyes. "Richard." My voice was soft. "Are you absolutely sure about this clause? Once we sign it, neither of us can claim anything the other owns in the future." The room exploded with laughter. Richard leaned back and laughed so hard he wiped a tear from his eye. "Undiscovered assets?" he gasped. "What are you hiding, Stella? A secret jar of pennies?" He slammed his hand on the table. "Stop playing games and sign." So I did. My signature slid across the paper. In that moment, Richard believed he had secured his fortune. What he had actually done was something far more expensive. He had just signed away any claim to the $1.2 trillion empire that legally belonged to me, and he still had no idea. But that wasn't the moment everything changed. The moment everything truly began was 20 minutes later, when I stepped outside the courthouse, pulled out my encrypted phone, and made a single call. Because by the time Richard finished celebrating his divorce victory that afternoon, his entire financial world was already collapsing. And he didn't even know why. 20 minutes after my husband handed me a $5,000 divorce settlement, I stood on the courthouse steps under the warm California sun and authorized the financial collapse of 3 different empires. Not with anger, not with revenge, just with a phone call. If you've ever watched someone celebrate a victory that secretly sealed their own downfall, you'll understand exactly how calm I felt in that moment. The courthouse doors closed behind me with a heavy echo. Outside, the afternoon traffic of downtown San Jose moved like nothing important had happened. People rushed past carrying coffee cups and briefcases. No one noticed the woman standing on the marble steps, holding a cheap purse and wearing a beige cardigan. To them, I looked like someone who had just lost everything, which was exactly how I wanted it. I walked down the steps, slowly. Once I reached the sidewalk, I reached inside my purse and ignored my old cracked smartphone. Instead, I pulled out a second device, hidden in the inner pocket. Black titanium. Biometric locked. Military-grade encryption. The screen lit up the moment my thumb touched it. Within seconds, the device connected through a secure satellite network that bypassed every public telecom line. One contact appeared at the top of the screen. Sterling, Chief Trustee. I pressed the call button. The line connected almost instantly. "Good afternoon, Madam Chairwoman." The voice on the other end sounded calm, professional, and completely prepared. I leaned against the stone railing overlooking the street. "Richard, sign the severance clause." I kept my tone steady. "The postnuptial waiver is filed and legally binding." There was a short pause. Then I heard the faint sound of someone exhaling. "Understood." Mr. Sterling's voice lowered slightly. "We have been awaiting confirmation for 7 years. Are you ready to activate the trust?" I looked down at the busy street. Cars passed. A taxi honked. A couple argued near the parking meter. The world continued, like nothing historic had just happened. "Yes, unlock the Aegis Global Trust." For a brief moment, the line stayed silent. Then Mr. Sterling spoke again. "Initiating transfer authorization." The digital confirmation appeared on my screen. Access level. Chairwoman Trust. Value. $1.2 trillion US. For the first time in my life, the empire my parents had built was fully in my control. But money alone wasn't the point. What mattered was leverage. Mr. Sterling spoke again. "Your first directives, madam?" I didn't hesitate. "Begin acquisition of Caldwell Venture Partners." Another pause, then a soft chuckle. "Understood. The hostile takeover will begin immediately." I ended the call. The moment the screen went dark, I slipped the phone back into my purse. From the outside, nothing about me had changed. Still the quiet woman with the cheap clothes. Still the woman Richard thought he had just discarded. But inside the financial networks of the world, massive gears had just begun turning. I raised my hand and flagged down a taxi. The yellow cab pulled over beside the curb. "Where to?" the driver asked. I gave him the address of Richard's house. The driver glanced at me in the mirror. "Rough day?" "Something like that." The ride across town took 15 minutes. During that time, my tablet buzzed quietly inside my purse. Not messages, executions, bank calls, server commands, corporate asset reviews. The machinery of Aegis Global had woken up, and once that machine started moving, it didn't stop. When the cab pulled into the quiet suburban neighborhood, I immediately noticed something strange. The front lawn of Richard's house looked like a yard sale after a tornado. Boxes everywhere. Clothes scattered, broken frames. For a moment, I thought thieves had broken in. Then I saw who was standing on the porch. Brenda Caldwell, my former mother-in-law, 62 years old. Designer clothes, permanent disapproval, and currently holding one of my antique restoration toolboxes. Before I could even step out of the cab, she tipped the box forward. The contents spilled down the front steps. Delicate brass tools clattered across the concrete. Specialized bone folders, horsehair brushes, handcrafted binding presses. Tools that had taken me years to collect. I paid the driver and stepped out of the cab. Brenda looked up. Her lips curled immediately. "Oh, good. You're finally here." She walked down the steps and kicked one of the wooden boxes with her shoe. "Richard called me. Said you actually signed the waiver and took the $5,000 like a sensible girl." She gestured to the lawn. "So I figured I'd help clean up your garbage before Sienna moves in." I walked slowly across the grass, each step crunching softly. "You're throwing away my equipment," Brenda laughed. "Equipment? Sweetheart, you glue old books together. That's not equipment. That's arts and crafts." She pointed toward the scattered tools. "Pack it up and get off my son's property. We're redecorating." I looked down at one of my brass restoration presses lying in the dirt. It had been custom-made in Florence. Nearly 200 years old. Registered artifact. Insured for nearly $500,000. Brenda had no idea. None of them did. "Sienna's a proper woman," Brenda continued proudly. "Her father runs one of the biggest banks in the state. She can elevate Richard. What could you possibly offer? You have no family, no connections, no future." Her voice carried the same tone she had used for years, that slow, poisonous superiority. 7 years of it. 7 years of pretending I didn't notice. 7 years of waiting. A year ago, her words might have hurt. But today, They sounded small, almost amusing. I bent down and picked up one of my brass tools. Then I checked the time on my watch. "You really shouldn't have touched these, Brenda." She laughed loudly. "Why? Are they magic?" I looked at her calmly. "Every item on this lawn is a registered historical artifact. The insurance coverage alone exceeds your son's net worth." Brenda burst out laughing. "Delusional. You're completely delusional." Before I could respond, another sound interrupted us. An engine. A loud one. A red Porsche convertible swung into the driveway and stopped abruptly. Sienna stepped out wearing sunglasses and a designer dress. She took one look at the yard and wrinkled her nose. "What is this mess?" Brenda sighed dramatically. "She refuses to leave. Claims her trash is worth millions." Sienna laughed. Then she walked toward me slowly. "Listen carefully, Stella." She pulled out her phone. "You have exactly 10 minutes to get your garbage and leave. If you're still here after that, I'm calling the police." I looked at her phone, then at her. "Your property?" "Yes. Richard and I are selling this place. We're upgrading to a $10 million house. Private tennis court, wine cellar, real life. You see, when you marry a man with ambition, things get better." Then she leaned closer. "And my father's bank is financing Richard's entire venture fund. We have money. We have power. You have nothing." I didn't respond, because at that exact moment, something interesting happened. The low rumble of diesel engines echoed down the street. All three of us turned. 3 massive black armored trucks rolled slowly around the corner. They drove directly toward the house. Sienna frowned. "What is that?" The first truck turned into the driveway. The second parked along the curb. The third blocked the street. Heavy reinforced doors opened. 12 men stepped out. Black suits, white gloves. Military precision. They looked more like a presidential security detail than a moving company. The lead officer walked straight toward me. He stopped 3 feet away. Then he bowed. "Good afternoon, Madam Chairwoman." Behind him, the team began carefully picking up every single tool Brenda had thrown on the lawn. They handled them like priceless museum artifacts. Which they were. Brenda blinked. Sienna stared. Neither of them spoke. The officer turned back to me. "The vault cases are prepared. Shall we secure your assets?" I nodded. "Proceed." And that's when Sienna started laughing, loudly. "Oh my God." She turned to Brenda. She hired actors. She spent her $5,000 hiring fake security guards to pack her junk. Brenda relaxed instantly. "Pathetic." She shook her head. "Stella, this is honestly embarrassing." But the logistics officer didn't react at all. Instead, he pulled out a titanium tablet. "Madam Chairwoman." He handed it to me. "The transfer of the $1.2 trillion holding trust is complete. Where shall we transport your assets?" I scanned the confirmation screen. Everything was finalized. Every company, every patent, every server farm, all under my authority. "Take them to the primary estate." "Yes, madam." Behind us, Sienna's laughter slowly faded, because something new had just happened. 2 more cars had turned into the street. Richard's black sports car and Jamal's bright yellow SUV. They pulled up behind the armored trucks. Richard stepped out laughing. Jamal followed, waving a cigar. But the moment they saw the convoy blocking the driveway, both of them stopped. And Richard said the exact words that made the situation even better. "Looks like the repo men finally found you, Stella." Jamal burst out laughing. "Man, she must be in serious debt." "Repo trucks for dusty books." Richard walked toward the lawn, shaking his head. "Thank God I made you sign that asset waiver this morning. Otherwise, these collectors might come after my money." I watched him, calmly. Then a long black Maybach pulled silently to the curb beside the trucks. My driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Richard frowned. I walked past him. Before stepping into the car, I looked at Jamal. "You should read the termination clause on your server contracts." Jamal blinked. "What?" I didn't answer. The window rolled up. The Maybach pulled away, leaving them standing in the driveway, still laughing, still celebrating, still completely unaware that in less than 48 hours, every dollar they believed they owned would disappear. But the real destruction didn't begin that afternoon. It began 2 days later, at Richard's celebration gala, when he tried to meet the mysterious new chairman of Aegis Global and discovered he had already met her. 48 hours after my husband celebrated our divorce with champagne and insults, he hosted a $500,000 investment gala and told everyone in the room he was about to become the next titan of Silicon Valley. That same night, his entire financial empire collapsed before dessert was served. And the most interesting part? He still had no idea I was the one responsible. If you've ever seen someone confidently walk into the trap they built themselves, you already understand why I accepted the invitation to his party. 2 nights after the divorce, I stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror inside the private residence owned by Aegis Global. The estate sat on nearly 40 acres in the hills overlooking San Francisco. I had technically owned it for years, but this was the first time I had ever stepped inside. The house was quiet. Soft piano music drifted from speakers hidden in the walls. A stylist adjusted the sleeve of my evening gown. Emerald silk. Custom tailored, worth more than Richard's $5,000 check. Mr. Sterling stood near the doorway holding a tablet. "Your transportation is ready, Madam Chairwoman." I nodded slightly. "Give me the situation report." He glanced at the screen. The margin call on Parker National Bank triggered exactly 36 hours ago. That was Sienna's father's bank, the institution Richard was relying on to fund his venture capital empire. Liquidity reserves have dropped 42%. Mr. Sterling continued. Federal auditors began investigating irregular loan structures this morning. I allowed myself a small smile. And Jamal, his crypto mining contracts were terminated yesterday. Server access revoked. Energy fraud investigation pending. Mr. Sterling paused. His leveraged positions are collapsing rapidly. Estimated personal losses currently exceed $11 million. Good. Then he added the final line. And Richard Caldwell's venture capital firm? Every one of their investors has frozen funding until the bank situation is resolved. His $500 million round is effectively dead. I nodded. Perfect timing. Because tonight, Richard believed he was celebrating the beginning of his empire. In reality, he was standing on the edge of a financial cliff. I picked up the diamond necklace resting on the vanity. It had belonged to my mother. 212 carats. Worth more than Richard's entire projected net worth. The irony almost made me laugh. "Are you ready?" Mr. Sterling asked. "Yes." Tonight, we finished the first act. 30 minutes later, my car arrived outside the Grand Aurelius Hotel in downtown San Francisco. The Aurelius was one of the most exclusive hotels in the state. 5-star, private investors only. And interestingly enough, 30% owned by Aegis Global, which meant technically, I owned part of the building Richard had rented for his celebration. The ballroom downstairs glowed with gold light. Crystal chandeliers reflected across hundreds of champagne glasses. A live jazz trio played softly in the corner. Silicon Valley investors filled the room. People who managed hedge funds, private equity executives, tech founders, men who thought controlling $10 billion made them powerful. None of them had any idea a trillion-dollar trust had just walked into the building. I didn't enter through the ballroom. Instead, my security escort led me through a private elevator to the VIP lounge above the main floor. From there, I could see everything, including Richard. He stood near the center of the ballroom, wearing a new tuxedo. Confidence radiated from him. He laughed loudly, shook hands aggressively, spoke with the arrogant excitement of a man who believed the future belonged to him. Sienna stood beside him, wearing a silver dress. She clung to his arm like she had already won. But one person looked different. Jamal. He stood at the bar, drinking whiskey too fast. His face glistened with sweat. His phone never left his hand. Because his crypto empire had started collapsing the moment my company shut off his servers. He just didn't know why yet. I leaned slightly against the balcony railing. Mr. Sterling stood beside me quietly. "They look confident," he said. "They won't. In a few minutes." Right on cue, Richard pulled out his phone and read a message. His face lit up immediately. He grabbed Sienna and Jamal and pulled them aside. From my vantage point, I could hear him clearly. "Listen." His voice trembled with excitement. "The Aegis Global chairman is here tonight." Jamal froze. "Are you serious?" Richard nodded. "One of the hotel executives just texted me. He's upstairs in the VIP lounge." Jamal grabbed Richard's shoulder. "You have to meet him. If you lock down Aegis money, we're untouchable." Sienna squeezed Richard's arm. "Baby, this is it." Richard straightened his bow tie confidently. "Don't worry. These old money billionaires respect bold ambition. I'll walk upstairs and come back with a $500 million anchor investment. He turned toward the staircase leading to the VIP level. I stepped away from the balcony and sat down calmly on the leather sofa. My security team positioned themselves quietly around the room. A few minutes later, the doors burst open. Richard walked in first. Sienna and Jamal followed. All three of them scanned the lounge excitedly. Richard spotted the group of security guards standing near my seating area. He smiled. That must be him. He walked straight toward us. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Richard addressed my security team confidently. "I'm Richard Caldwell, host of tonight's event. I was told the chairman of Aegis Global wanted to meet privately." My guards said nothing. They simply stood still. Richard frowned slightly, then stepped closer, trying to look past them. I gently set my champagne glass on the table. The sound made them all turn. I lifted one finger. My security team stepped aside. Richard finally saw me sitting there, and for a moment, the entire world stopped. His brain clearly couldn't process what he was seeing. "Stella?" Sienna gasped. "What are you doing here?" Jamal blinked repeatedly. Richard's shock lasted about 3 seconds. Then his face twisted with anger. "You followed me here?" He stepped forward, his voice dripping with disgust. "Did you spend the $5,000 I gave you renting a dress to sneak into this party?" Sienna laughed nervously. "Oh my God, she's stalking you." Richard pointed toward the door. "You have 5 seconds to leave before I have security throw you out." I lifted my glass and took a slow sip. "Richard," my voice remained calm. "I belong in this lounge. The real question is, why you think you do?" Jamal snapped. He grabbed a glass of bourbon from a nearby table. "You think you're better than us now?" Before anyone could react, he swung his arm, trying to throw the drink onto my dress. The motion never finished. One of my security officers caught his wrist midair, twisted it sharply. Jamal screamed. The glass shattered on the floor. The guard forced him to his knees in less than 2 seconds. "Let go of me!" Richard stepped forward furiously. "Take your hands off him. I'm the host here. I'll have you arrested." The commotion brought the hotel manager running into the room. Richard immediately pointed at me. "This woman snuck in here. Throw her out." The manager didn't look at Richard. Instead, he walked directly toward me, then bowed. "Madam." His voice shook slightly. "I sincerely apologize. Are these individuals disturbing you?" Richard stared in confusion. "Why are you bowing to her?" The manager straightened slowly. "Because she owns 30% of this hotel." Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. Richard blinked, then laughed. "Oh, I see." He pointed at me. "You're sleeping with the real chairman. That's how you got in here. You found yourself a rich sugar daddy." I didn't answer, because at that exact moment, Sienna's phone rang. She looked irritated, then answered. "Daddy, what do you—" Her voice stopped. The color drained from her face. "What do you mean the bank is under investigation?" Richard frowned. "What?" Sienna started shaking. "Federal agents are at the bank. They froze everything. Daddy says someone called in hundreds of millions in loans." Richard's face slowly changed because he suddenly understood something terrifying. His venture capital fund wasn't backed by real money. It was backed by loans from Sienna's father's bank, and that bank had just been financially attacked. His phone buzzed. He opened the message. "Then read it out loud. Your funding request is denied. Your firm is under audit. The Aegis Global chairman will see you tomorrow at the final divorce asset hearing." Richard looked at me again, but for the first time, his confidence was gone. And the worst part? Tomorrow's court hearing was the moment when the entire truth would finally be revealed. Because Richard still believed he was going there to secure funding, he had no idea. He was about to watch the judge announce the identity of the Aegis Global chairman and hear the number that would destroy his sanity forever. $1.2 trillion. At 8:15 the next morning, less than 12 hours after Richard's celebration gala collapsed into panic, my ex-husband walked into the courthouse convinced he was about to secure a $500 million investment. Instead, he was about to hear a number so large it would shatter his mind. If you've ever watched someone cling desperately to a fantasy while reality is already collapsing around them, you'll understand exactly how Richard looked that morning. The sky above downtown San Jose was clear and bright. Cold morning light reflected off the glass towers surrounding the courthouse. Richard's black sports car pulled into the parking lot at exactly 8:12. He stepped out, wearing the same confidence he had carried the night before, but it was thinner now. Forced. Sienna climbed out of the passenger's side, her makeup carefully redone after the crying from the previous night. Jamal arrived seconds later in his bright yellow SUV. He looked worse. Dark circles under his eyes, hands shaking slightly. His phone had been ringing all night. Liquidation alerts, server shutdown notices, margin calls. But Jamal still believed everything would be fixed because Richard kept repeating the same thing. The Aegis chairman wants to meet me. That meant rescue. At least in their minds. They climbed the courthouse steps together. Brenda Caldwell was already waiting in the lobby. She stood near the metal detectors, wearing a bright pink designer suit and a look of permanent irritation. There you are. She waved them over impatiently. This place smells like cheap disinfectant. Let's get this nonsense over with. She glanced around the crowded lobby. Honestly, Richard, I don't understand why we're even here today. That girl already signed the divorce papers. You should be celebrating. Richard forced a smile. We are celebrating. He adjusted his tie. Today just happens to be the day I secure our future. Sienna looked at him nervously. Are you sure the chairman will actually show up? Richard nodded confidently. Think about it. Why would the head of Aegis Global personally attend a divorce hearing unless he wanted to restructure the assets involved? This is a loyalty test. If I impress him today, my fund gets funded directly. Jamal wiped sweat from his forehead. Just get the money, man. My servers are still offline. I'm losing thousands every hour. Richard clapped him on the shoulder. Relax. By lunchtime, we'll all be celebrating again. None of them noticed the black SUV parked across the street, or the security team already monitoring the courthouse entrance. Inside the courtroom, the air felt cool and quiet. 2 long tables faced the elevated judge's bench. Richard sat at the respondent's table, Sienna beside him. His lawyer flipped through paperwork nervously. Brenda and Jamal sat in the gallery behind them. The room remained empty. Richard leaned back in his chair. Where is she? His lawyer glanced toward the door. The hearing starts in 5 minutes. Richard smirked. Maybe Stella's too embarrassed to show up. Jamal chuckled weakly, probably hiding in some cheap apartment. Then the courtroom doors opened. But it wasn't me. 4 federal agents walked in first. Dark suits, holstered weapons, serious expressions. Behind them walked the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. Not the usual family court judge. This man handled federal financial cases. The entire room stiffened. Richard blinked. Why is the Chief Justice here? His lawyer frowned. I don't know. The agents positioned themselves around the room, 2 near the doors, 2 near a single, high-backed leather chair that had been placed in the center of the room. It wasn't there during the first mediation. It looked like a throne, reserved for someone important. Richard leaned toward Sienna. See that? That's for him. The chairman. Sienna nodded nervously. This was happening. Richard straightened his posture, practicing his confident smile again. Then the doors opened one more time. I stepped into the courtroom. No cardigan, no cheap purse, just a tailored charcoal suit and a thin leather portfolio. Richard's smile vanished instantly. You have got to be kidding me. He jumped up and rushed toward me before I could reach the table. What are you doing here? His voice hissed with irritation. You already signed the divorce agreement. You're just here to cause problems now. He grabbed my arm lightly. Go sit in the back. The Aegis chairman is about to walk in. If he sees you sitting at the main table looking like this, he'll think my firm is a joke. I looked down at his hand, then slowly back up at his face. Richard released my arm. Something in my expression made him uncomfortable. I walked past him without answering, down the center aisle, past the petitioner's table, past his lawyer, past the gallery, and directly toward the leather chair in the center of the room. The federal agents stepped aside. I sat down calmly, placed my portfolio on the table, folded my hands. The entire room froze. Richard stared, his brain clearly malfunctioning. Get out of that chair. His voice rose. That seat is reserved for the chairman. He took 2 steps toward me. The 2 federal agents behind my chair immediately moved forward, hands resting on their holsters. Step back, sir. The lead agent's voice carried lethal authority. 1 more step toward the chairwoman, and you will be detained. Chairwoman. The word hung in the air. Richard froze, then slowly stepped back. His mind twisted the situation instantly. He convinced himself the agent was joking or mocking me because the alternative was impossible. The Chief Justice lifted his gavel. The sharp crack echoed through the courtroom. This court is now in session. His deep voice commanded the room instantly. The divorce proceedings previously scheduled for today have been superseded by federal jurisdiction. Richard frowned. What? The judge continued. This hearing has been repurposed to oversee the unsealing and transfer of the Aegis Global Trust. A murmur rippled through the room. Sienna leaned toward Richard. What does that mean? Richard whispered excitedly. It means the chairman is about to finalize a deal. He glanced at Jamal. I told you. Jamal nodded rapidly. This is huge. The Chief Justice lifted a sealed envelope, dark red wax stamped with an elaborate crest. This document contains the founding will of Aegis Global. He broke the seal. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Then, he began reading. The Aegis Global Trust currently holds controlling ownership of 40% of the United States data center infrastructure. Jamal's mouth fell open. 40%? The judge continued. The trust also owns over 3,000 foundational patents related to artificial intelligence processing networks. Richard's eyes sparkled. This was everything. Global telecommunications infrastructure, international real estate holdings, strategic financial institutions, total estimated valuation. The judge paused. Then read the number. $1.2 trillion. The entire courtroom fell silent. Brenda gasped loudly. Sienna grabbed Richard's arm. Jamal whispered hoarsely, "We're rich." Richard stared at the empty space behind me, waiting for the mysterious chairman to walk through the door. But no one entered. Instead, the Chief Justice lowered the papers, then looked directly at me. As stipulated in the founding documents, the trust transfer is contingent upon two conditions: the beneficiary reaching 33 years of age, and the legal severance of all parasitic financial ties. He lifted the divorce waiver Richard forced me to sign. Yesterday afternoon, those conditions were fulfilled. The Chief Justice inclined his head slightly. Congratulations, Chairwoman Stella Morgan. The world stopped. Richard blinked. Once. Twice. Then, the truth hit him, and the color drained completely from his face. But the real explosion hadn't happened yet, because Richard still believed he could claim half of the fortune, and he was about to say the exact words that would destroy his last chance forever. The moment the judge spoke the words, Chairwoman Stella Morgan, the courtroom fell into a silence so deep, it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. 3 seconds later, Richard Caldwell's entire sense of reality shattered. But instead of accepting the truth, he did what desperate people always do. He started calculating how much money he could still steal from it. If you've ever seen someone realize they destroyed their own future with their own signature, you'll understand why the next 5 minutes became the most expensive lesson Richard would ever learn. Richard didn't move at first. His eyes stayed locked on me, wide, unblinking. The confident venture capitalist who had strutted into the room 30 minutes earlier had vanished. Now he looked like someone staring at a ghost. No. He whispered the word like a child refusing to believe bad news. No, that's not possible. His voice. This is wrong. He pointed at me with a trembling finger. She fixes old books in a basement archive. She makes minimum wage. She's broke. The Chief. Richard turned to his lawyer desperately. Tell them this is a mistake. His lawyer didn't speak. Instead, he slowly removed his glasses, because the truth had already been confirmed. Sienna stood up suddenly. Her chair scraped loudly across the floor. You're lying. Her voice shook. You're lying. She looked at me with growing horror. The Aegis Global Chairman can't be her. Richard shook his head violently. Exactly. He pointed toward the judge. This has to be some legal misunderstanding. The judge calmly lifted the document again. The beneficiary is Stella Morgan. Richard laughed, but it sounded wrong. Thin, broken. That's impossible. We were married for 7 years. 7 years. His voice grew stronger as his brain desperately searched for an escape, which means half of everything she owns is legally mine. Sienna's head snapped toward him, her eyes lit with desperate hope. Yes, that's right. Marital property. Richard looked around the courtroom triumphantly. Under California law, assets acquired during marriage are split equally. He turned back to the judge. Which means half of that $1 trillion belongs to me. 600 billion. The number echoed in the room. Jamal inhaled sharply. 600 billion. His entire body trembled. Richard grinned. The arrogance returned instantly. He looked at me again. See? Even if you tricked everyone into believing this fantasy, you still owe me half. Because we were married. Sienna grabbed his arm. Richard, we're saved. Brenda leaned forward from the gallery. I knew it. I knew my son would win. Richard looked back at me smugly. You thought you were clever, but you forgot something. You were my wife, which means you can't escape me. I didn't interrupt him. I let him finish. Because sometimes the most powerful moment in a story isn't the reveal. It's the silence before it. When Richard finished speaking, I slowly opened my portfolio. The courtroom watched, every eye locked onto the movement. I pulled out a single document, then slid it across the table. The paper stopped directly in front of him. Richard frowned. What is this? You should recognize it. My voice remained calm. You wrote it. Richard looked down. Then his expression changed, because he recognized the document instantly. The post-nuptial agreement, the one he had forced me to sign. His lawyer closed his eyes. Richard's stomach visibly tightened. I tapped the fourth page. Please read the clause you insisted on. Richard hesitated. Then read it silently. His lips moved. Both parties permanently waive all rights to any current or future undiscovered assets. His breathing slowed, then stopped. The realization began crawling across his face like a shadow. I leaned forward slightly. You were so worried I might try to take your venture capital money one day. So you created the most aggressive financial waiver your lawyer could write. You made sure neither of us could ever claim future assets from the other. Richard stared at the paper. The black ink of his signature sat at the bottom, bold, permanent. I continued speaking. You laughed while you forced me to sign it. You called me dead weight. You said I brought no value to your life. I looked him directly in the eyes. And now that exact clause protects my inheritance from you. The judge confirmed it, calmly. The waiver is legally binding. Mr. Caldwell has no claim to the Aegis Global Trust. Richard blinked slowly, once, twice. Then the full weight of the truth hit him. $600 billion. Gone. Not stolen, not lost. Signed away by his own hand. His knees buckled. He grabbed the table to stay standing. No. His voice cracked. No. He looked at his lawyer. Fix this. His lawyer shook his head slowly. Richard's breathing turned frantic. No. He grabbed the document. This can't be legal. I didn't know. The judge's voice cut through the room. You insisted on the clause, Mr. Caldwell. Richard stared at the paper again, his brain desperately replaying the memory. The mediation room. The check. The laughter. The pen. His signature. He had been smiling, while he erased his own future. His chest rose and fell rapidly. Then the sound came. At first, it was just a laugh. Quiet. Unstable. Then louder and louder, until Richard was laughing hysterically in the middle of the courtroom. Sienna stared at him in horror. Richard, stop. But he didn't. He kept laughing, because the human brain cannot process losing $600 billion in one moment. Eventually, the laughter collapsed into something else. A raw, broken scream. He slammed his fists onto the table. You tricked me! The sound echoed across the courtroom. I watched him, calmly. No, Richard. You tricked yourself. His breathing turned ragged. You hid it from me. You lied about who you were. I tilted my head slightly. My father hid it. To make sure I married someone who loved me, without knowing my money. Then I asked a quiet question, and the entire room listened. Tell me honestly, Richard, if you had known I owned $1 trillion trust, would you have ever asked me for that divorce? Richard froze, because everyone already knew the answer. But the story wasn't over yet, because while Richard was breaking down emotionally, someone else in the room had just realized something far worse. Jamal. And the moment he understood what my company actually controlled, he started trying to quietly leave the courtroom. Exactly 6 minutes after Richard realized he had signed away $600 billion, another man in the courtroom quietly stood up and began walking toward the exit. That man was Jamal. And he had just realized that the person who owned the company controlling his entire crypto operation was sitting 10 feet away from him. If you've ever watched someone suddenly understand that their financial survival depends on the person they spent years mocking, you'll understand why Jamal looked like a man walking toward his own execution. while Richard continued spiraling into hysterical disbelief at the respondents' table. Jamal slowly slipped off the wooden bench in the gallery. He moved carefully, quietly, trying not to attract attention. His bright velvet jacket, which he had worn proudly just a day earlier, was now soaked with sweat because Jamal had finally connected the dots. Aegis Global owned 40% of the nation's data center infrastructure. Those same server farms powered his crypto mining operation. The same servers I had already ordered shut down. Jamal glanced toward the courtroom door, only 15 steps away. If he could leave now, maybe he could still salvage something. Maybe he could call someone. Maybe he could move assets. Maybe Stella's voice cut through the room. Where exactly do you think you're going, Jamal? His entire body froze. The courtroom turned toward him instantly. Jamal slowly turned around. His eyes met mine. For the first time since I had known him, Jamal Harris looked afraid. His voice cracked, getting some air. You should sit down. My tone stayed calm. We're not finished here. Jamal swallowed hard. He glanced toward Richard, but Richard wasn't paying attention. Richard was still staring at the waiver agreement like it might suddenly disappear. So Jamal made a different decision. He tried to laugh. Oh, come on, Stella. He spread his hands dramatically. You won. You're rich. Congratulations. No reason to drag everyone else down with you. I tilted my head slightly. Drag you down? He nodded quickly. Yeah. My crypto nodes already crashed. You shut down my servers. That's enough punishment. You made your point. His smile was thin, desperate. Let's just call it even. The courtroom stayed silent. Then I stood up slowly. The federal agents shifted slightly behind me, not threatening, just present. Jamal watched every movement, his breathing getting heavier. Even? I repeated the word softly. You think we're even? Jamal forced another laugh. You got revenge. You shut down my business. Fair enough. We're family. Family. That word again. I walked slowly toward him. My heels echoed across the courtroom floor. 7 years, Jamal. 7 years you sat at my kitchen table eating food I paid for. 7 years you laughed at my clothes. 7 years you told Richard I was holding him back. Jamal's smile faded. And yesterday morning you stood in a courtroom and laughed while your sister-in-law threw a $100 bill at my feet. The memory hung in the air. Jamal's eyes dropped to the floor. You told me to take a cab and disappear. I stopped walking a few feet away from him. And now you think shutting down your crypto servers makes us even? Jamal wiped sweat from his forehead. Look, his voice lowered. You don't understand how those operations work. I understand perfectly. I reached into my portfolio, then handed a thick file to one of the federal agents. The agent opened it immediately. The pages inside contained dozens of printed records, server logs, electricity usage reports, transaction trails. The agent flipped through the documents, then looked directly at Jamal. Jamal Harris. He spoke with professional calm. You are currently under investigation for large-scale energy theft and financial fraud. Jamal blinked. What? The agent continued reading. Over the past 18 months, you illegally siphoned electrical power from the municipal grid to operate unauthorized cryptocurrency mining rigs. The words hit Jamal like a punch. No. Additionally, the agent continued, you used proprietary trading algorithms belonging to Caldwell Venture Partners to manipulate digital asset markets. Richard's head snapped up. What? The agent closed the file. The Securities and Exchange Commission has been notified. Jamal took a step backward. This is insane. He pointed at me. She's lying. She's making this up. I folded my arms calmly. Jamal, my company owns the server infrastructure you were using. We have your entire transaction history. Every wallet, every energy siphon, every manipulated trade. Jamal's legs buckled slightly. You stole millions of dollars. His breathing turned shallow. He looked around desperately. Richard, tell them. Richard didn't move. He was still staring at the waiver document like his life depended on it. Jamal's voice cracked. Stella, please. The bravado vanished completely now. He took another step toward me. I lost everything already. My servers are offline. My investors are gone. You made your point. Please don't destroy the rest of my life. I watched him quietly. Jamal dropped to his knees. The courtroom gasped softly. He clasped his hands together. Please. His voice broke. You can't send me to prison. We're family. Family again. I reached into my suit pocket, slowly, pulled out a single folded bill, $100. The same bill Sienna had thrown at me in the mediation room. I held it between my fingers. You told me this was enough for a cab ride. I let the bill fall. It fluttered through the air, landing gently on Jamal's shoulder. Maybe it's enough for the prison bus. The courtroom went silent. One of the federal agents stepped forward. Jamal Harris, you are under arrest, pending investigation for federal wire fraud, energy theft, and securities manipulation. Cold metal handcuffs snapped around his wrists. The sound echoed across the courtroom. Jamal didn't resist. He just stared at the floor, broken, completely defeated. As the agents lifted him to his feet, he looked at me one last time, but the arrogance was gone. Only fear remained. And behind him, at the respondents' table, Richard had finally stopped laughing, because while Jamal was being arrested, Richard had just realized something even worse. If Jamal's fraud investigation reached Caldwell Venture Partners, then Richard's venture capital firm might be involved too. And that meant the destruction of his career had only just begun. 3 minutes after Jamal Harris was handcuffed in the middle of the courtroom, the man who had laughed while giving me a $5,000 divorce settlement finally realized something even worse than losing $600 billion. He realized the federal agents in the room weren't just there to protect me. They were there for him. If you've ever seen the moment when someone understands their life is about to collapse legally, not just financially, you'll understand why Richard Caldwell suddenly stopped breathing. The courtroom doors closed behind the agents escorting Jamal out. His footsteps faded down the hallway. For a moment, the room fell completely silent. Then Sienna spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Richard, she grabbed his sleeve. Tell me he didn't use your firm. Richard slowly lifted his head. His face looked hollow. What? Your algorithms. Her voice shook. The agents said he used your trading algorithms. Richard's eyes flicked toward the federal agent still standing near the judge's bench. And for the first time that morning, he looked afraid. Because Richard Caldwell had spent the last 3 years building Caldwell Venture Partners around proprietary trading models. Algorithms designed to detect early investment signals in emerging tech markets. The models were extremely valuable and extremely confidential. But Jamal had spent months bragging about his crypto profits, months talking about impossible timing, months claiming he had some special edge. Richard had never questioned it. Now the pieces were coming together. Richard stood slowly, his chair scraped across the courtroom floor. That's not possible. His voice sounded weaker now. Jamal didn't have access to our systems. One of the federal agents stepped forward. Actually, he did. Richard turned toward him sharply. The agent opened the file I had handed over earlier. Our investigation shows repeated server access originating from Caldwell Venture Partners' internal network. Richard's heart visibly skipped a beat. Unauthorized access. The agent continued calmly, which means either your security protocols were catastrophically negligent, or someone inside your firm granted him permission. Richard's breathing turned shallow. Sienna stared at him. You told him, didn't you? Richard shook his head violently. No, I didn't. Her voice rose. You let him use your systems. Richard slammed his hands on the table. I said no. But the agent continued reading. Multiple trading events correspond directly with Jamal Harris's crypto wallet transactions. Richard felt the floor disappear beneath him. Those weren't just security violations. They were evidence. Evidence linking his firm to financial fraud. The Chief Justice leaned forward slightly. Mr. Caldwell. His voice remained calm, but firm. Given the circumstances, the court will need to determine whether Caldwell Venture Partners is implicated in these activities. Richard's lawyer stood abruptly. Your Honor. The judge raised a hand. Sit down. The lawyer sat, because he already knew. If federal agents were involved, the case had moved far beyond family court. Sienna looked like she might faint. Richard. Her voice trembled. Tell them you didn't know. Richard didn't answer, because suddenly, his phone began vibrating inside his jacket pocket. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent courtroom. He slowly pulled it out. 3 new messages. One from his firm's compliance department, another from his largest investor, and the third from Parker National Bank, the bank Sienna's father ran. His hands trembled as he opened the first message. Account access suspended. Federal audit in progress. Richard's stomach dropped. He opened the second message. All investments frozen, pending investigation. Then, The third, Parker National Bank liquidity failure. All credit lines terminated. Richard's vision blurred. Everything was collapsing at once. Sienna grabbed his arm. What does it say? Richard didn't answer. He couldn't, because his entire business had just been erased. Jamal's fraud had triggered a federal investigation. The bank funding his firm had collapsed under a margin call. His investors had frozen their capital. His accounts were locked. Caldwell Venture Partners no longer existed. His voice finally returned, barely. My firm. He looked at the judge. My firm didn't do anything illegal. The Chief Justice studied him for a moment. That remains to be determined. Richard turned toward me slowly. His eyes burned with a mixture of rage and terror. You did this. Not a question. An accusation. You destroyed my bank. You shut down Jamal's servers. You triggered the investigation. I didn't deny it. I didn't confirm it either. I simply looked at him calmly. Richard, you built your empire on borrowed money. You trusted the wrong people. You wrote the legal clause that cut yourself off from my fortune. Every decision that destroyed you. You made yourself. His chest heaved. You planned this. No, I corrected quietly. I prepared for it. The distinction mattered because revenge is emotional. Preparation is patient. And for 7 years, I had been patient. Richard stared at me with growing desperation. You could stop this. His voice cracked. You control the bank. You control the servers. You control the investigation. The courtroom watched. Richard Caldwell, venture capitalist, partner, rising Silicon Valley star, was begging. Stop it. His voice dropped. Please. The word barely escaped his mouth. For the first time since our divorce hearing began, Richard looked small. I studied him carefully. 7 years of memories passed through my mind. The apartment we once shared. The nights I worked 3 jobs. The way he used to say, thank you. Before success changed him. Before arrogance replaced gratitude. The room waited for my answer. And then I asked him a quiet question. Richard, if our positions were reversed today, if you were sitting in this chair with $1 trillion and I was the one who had betrayed you, would you help me? Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because we both knew the truth. And that was the moment I understood something important. The most dangerous moment in revenge is not anger, it's silence. Because silence forces the other person to face exactly who they are. Richard slowly lowered his head. His shoulders sagged. The fight drained out of him. But the courtroom drama wasn't over yet, because someone else in the room had just snapped. And the next person to explode wasn't Richard. It was Sienna. Less than 10 seconds after Richard Caldwell finished begging the woman he had mocked 2 days earlier, the person sitting beside him finally snapped. And when Sienna Parker lost control, the entire courtroom turned into a battlefield. If you've ever seen someone realize their entire future was built on a lie, you'll understand why Sienna didn't scream at me first. She screamed at Richard. The silence after my question hung in the air like heavy fog. Richard still hadn't answered. He couldn't, because we both knew exactly what he would have done. He would have crushed me, without hesitation, without mercy. Sienna was staring at him, her eyes wide, her breathing uneven. Richard, her voice trembled. Say something. Richard kept looking at the table, his shoulders slumped. Sienna's expression changed. The panic disappeared, and something darker replaced it. Disbelief. You told me this was under control. Her voice rose. You told me the fund was safe. Richard rubbed his forehead. Sienna, you told me my father's bank was secure. Her voice cracked louder now. You said the loans were guaranteed. Richard stood slowly. Lower your voice. But she didn't. Her anger had already exploded. My father is in federal custody right now. She pointed at him with a shaking hand. And you're standing here begging your ex-wife for mercy. The courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Richard's lawyer tried to intervene. Miss Parker, stay out of this, she snapped. Her eyes returned to Richard. You said you were about to control $500 million. Richard's voice dropped. That was before. Before what? Before she destroyed everything? Sienna turned toward me. Her eyes burned with fury. You did this. I didn't move. You ruined my father. You shut down our bank. You destroyed our future. She took a step toward me. You think money makes you powerful? Her voice trembled between rage and hysteria. You think you can just erase people's lives? The federal agents behind me shifted slightly, but I lifted one hand. They stayed still. Because Sienna wasn't dangerous. She was desperate. And desperate people reveal the truth. You stole everything from us. Her voice broke. You took everything. I tilted my head slightly. No, I corrected quietly. I took back what was mine. The difference matters. Sienna stared at me like she might actually lunge. But then her expression twisted, and suddenly she laughed. A short, bitter sound. This is insane. She pointed toward Richard. You left your wife for me. You promised me power. You promised my father a partnership. And now look at you. Richard's jaw tightened. Stop. You lost everything. She stepped closer to him now. My father is going to prison. My family's bank is gone. And you're sitting here crying over a divorce agreement. Her voice dropped into a whisper. You're pathetic. Richard's temper finally snapped. He grabbed her wrist. Enough. She yanked her arm away. Don't touch me. Richard's eyes burned with anger. You think I did this? You dragged me into your father's mess. Her eyes widened. My father's mess? Yes. Richard stepped forward. Your father built that bank on debt. Your father pushed those loans. Your father. Her hand moved faster than anyone expected. The slap echoed across the courtroom. Richard's head snapped sideways. The room froze. Sienna's chest heaved. Don't you dare blame my father. Richard slowly turned back toward her, a red mark already forming on his cheek. You think I'm the villain here? His voice was dangerously quiet. You were sleeping with me before the divorce papers were even filed. Sienna's eyes flickered. You promised me a future. Richard laughed bitterly. You promised yourself a billionaire husband. The words landed like a bomb. Sienna's face went pale. The courtroom murmured softly because everyone suddenly understood something. This wasn't love. It never had been. It was a transaction. And the transaction had failed. Sienna turned toward me again, her voice suddenly smaller. You did all this just to hurt us. I studied her carefully. No, I did it because you showed me exactly who you were. The room stayed silent. I continued calmly. 2 days ago, you threw $100 at me. You told me to take a cab and disappear. You believed power belonged only to people who already had money. Sienna swallowed hard. And now? I asked. Now you're discovering something important. Her voice barely moved. What? I held her gaze. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. It waits. It watches. And when the moment comes, it moves quietly. Sienna shook her head slowly. You're a monster. Maybe, I said softly. But I didn't start this war. You did. She looked down at the floor, then suddenly started laughing again. Not hysterically this time. Just hollow. Well, congratulations. You won. Her voice was flat now. You destroyed all of us. Richard, my father, Jamal. Everyone. She looked up one last time. I hope you're proud. I didn't answer, because pride wasn't the emotion I felt. Relief was. 7 years of humiliation had finally ended, but the courtroom drama wasn't finished. Because the federal agent who had arrested Jamal had just returned through the courtroom doors, and he was carrying a new folder, a thicker one. He walked directly toward the judge, whispered something quietly. The Chief Justice opened the file. His expression changed slightly. Then he looked directly at Richard. Mr. Caldwell. His voice echoed across the room. It appears the investigation into Caldwell Venture Partners has produced additional findings. Richard's stomach dropped, and the next words the judge spoke were the ones that finally broke him completely. The Securities and Exchange Commission has issued an immediate warrant for your financial records. The moment the judge said the words, financial records warrant, Richard Caldwell stopped breathing. Because unlike losing money, unlike losing investors, unlike even losing $600 billion, a federal warrant meant prison was suddenly a real possibility. If you've ever seen a powerful man realize the system he trusted is about to turn against him, you'll understand why Richard's hands began to shake. The courtroom had already been tense. Now it felt suffocating. The federal agent placed the thick folder on the judge's bench. The Chief Justice flipped through the pages slowly. Every sound of turning paper echoed across the silent room. Richard stood frozen beside his table. His lawyer leaned closer and whispered urgently, "Do not say anything. Do not answer questions." Richard barely heard him. His mind was racing through every deal he had ever approved, every shortcut, every risky loan structure, every time he trusted Jamal's crypto insight. The judge finished reviewing the documents, then looked up. "Mr. Caldwell, please return to your seat." Richard didn't move. His lawyer grabbed his sleeve and gently pulled him down. Richard sat, stiff, unstable. The judge spoke again. "Federal investigators have uncovered irregularities in several investment vehicles associated with Caldwell Venture Partners." Richard swallowed hard. "Those irregularities include unreported algorithmic trading activity connected to cryptocurrency exchanges currently under investigation." Jamal. The word echoed in Richard's head like a gunshot. His lawyer stood again. "Your Honor, my client, sit down." The judge's voice cut him off instantly. "This is not a defense hearing. This is a notification of investigation." The courtroom murmured quietly. Richard's chest rose and fell rapidly. The judge continued reading. "Preliminary findings suggest that proprietary trading algorithms belonging to Caldwell Venture Partners were used to manipulate digital asset markets." Richard whispered under his breath. "I didn't know." The judge heard him. "That remains to be determined." Sienna slowly sank back into her chair. Her face had gone completely pale. Richard turned toward his lawyer again. "Say something." The lawyer leaned close, quietly. "The SEC doesn't issue warrants unless they already have evidence." Richard's stomach dropped. Evidence. That meant logs, transactions, server access, which meant Jamal. Richard suddenly understood the full chain reaction. Jamal's arrest, the server shutdowns, the bank collapse, the frozen investors, the federal investigation, all of it connected. And all of it had started with one decision: the divorce. His eyes slowly drifted across the courtroom until they landed on me, still sitting calmly in the leather chair, watching, observing, like someone studying a chessboard after the final move. Richard stood again. This time, no one stopped him. He walked toward me slowly, his steps uneven. The federal agents watched closely, but they allowed him to approach. He stopped a few feet away. His voice sounded hollow. "Did you know?" "Know what?" "About Jamal. About the investigation." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked him a question. "Richard, when you forced me to sign that waiver agreement, did you know Jamal was using your firm's algorithms?" Richard flinched. The silence gave him away. "You suspected it," I continued calmly, "but you didn't care. Because as long as the profits kept coming, you looked the other way." Richard's jaw tightened. "That's not. You built a company around shortcuts. You trusted a man who bragged about cheating systems. You accepted money from a bank built on unstable debt. Every risk you took was a choice." His voice rose. "You're pretending you're innocent." I never said that. I stood slowly. The room watched again. "But there's a difference between preparation and corruption." Richard's breathing became heavier. "You could stop this." He said it again, this time with desperation. "You control Aegis Global. You control the infrastructure. You control the banks. You control everything." The accusation hung in the air. I studied him quietly, then answered honestly. "I control my company, not your decisions." Richard laughed bitterly. "You destroyed me." "No." I shook my head slightly. "You destroyed yourself the moment you believed success made you untouchable." Richard's shoulders sagged. The fight drained out of him again. Behind us, the judge spoke. "Mr. Caldwell." Richard turned slowly. "You are required to submit all financial records of Caldwell Venture Partners within 48 hours. Failure to comply will result in immediate seizure of corporate assets." Richard nodded weakly, his voice barely audible. "Understood." The judge then turned toward me. "Chairwoman Morgan, the Aegis Global Trust Transfer is now officially recognized by this court." The final gavel strike echoed across the room. "This hearing is concluded." The courtroom erupted into quiet conversation. Lawyers gathering papers, agents speaking into radios, journalists rushing toward the hallway. But Richard didn't move. He just stood there, looking lost, because for the first time in years, he had no plan. No leverage, no advantage. Sienna slowly stood beside him. Her voice sounded distant. "I'm leaving." Richard looked at her. "What?" She avoided his eyes. "My father's lawyers want me back in New York." Richard stared. "You're leaving me here?" Sienna finally looked at him. "There's nothing left here." Her words landed like a final blow. Then she walked away, her heels echoing toward the exit. Richard didn't follow, because he knew something she hadn't realized yet. Running away wouldn't fix anything. The investigation was already moving. The damage was already done. And across the room, I was already preparing for the final move. Because while Richard believed the story was ending, the most important decision of his life was about to happen outside the courthouse. And he had no idea I had already arranged it. 30 minutes after the courtroom emptied, Richard Caldwell walked out of the courthouse, believing his life was officially over. His company was under federal investigation. His investors had frozen their capital. His bank had collapsed. His brother-in-law had been arrested. His fiancée had just left him. And he had just signed away $600 billion. But what Richard didn't realize was that the most important moment of his life was waiting for him on the courthouse steps. Because sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. Sometimes it's about letting someone finally see the truth. The afternoon sun hung low over downtown San Jose. News vans were already lining the street outside the courthouse. Reporters clustered near the entrance. Word about the Aegis Global Trust had spread faster than anyone expected. $1.2 trillion. The number alone was enough to attract media attention from across the country. Black SUVs were parked along the curb. Security teams stood quietly near the entrance. Richard pushed through the courthouse doors slowly. The sunlight made him squint. For a moment, he just stood there, like a man who didn't know where to go next. A few reporters noticed him immediately. "That's him," one of them whispered. "Richard Caldwell." Questions began flying instantly. "Mr. Caldwell, is it true your firm is under federal investigation? Did you knowingly allow crypto market manipulation? What's your response to the collapse of Parker National Bank?" Richard froze. Camera lenses pointed directly at his face. Flashes popped. His lawyer rushed beside him. No comment. He pushed Richard toward the sidewalk. But the reporters kept shouting, "Did you really sign away $500 billion in a divorce settlement?" Richard's shoulders tensed. He didn't answer. He just kept walking. Down the courthouse steps. Away from the cameras. Away from the noise. And straight toward the long black Maybach waiting at the curb. "My Maybach." Richard stopped. The rear door opened slowly. And I stepped out. The reporters instantly turned. Camera flashes exploded again. But Richard didn't notice them. He was staring at me. His voice came out hoarse. "You planned this." I shook my head slightly. "No. I prepared for it." The same answer I had given him before. Richard laughed quietly, a broken sound. "You destroyed everything. Your bank, your firm, your partners, your future." He rubbed his face. "I lost everything in 48 hours. I studied him carefully. The arrogance was gone. The polished confidence of a venture capitalist had disappeared. All that remained was a tired man in a wrinkled suit. 7 years ago," I said quietly, "you had nothing." Richard looked up slowly. "Nothing but student debt and a dream." He didn't deny it. "I worked 3 jobs so you could finish your degree." His eyes flickered. "I helped edit your thesis, packed your lunches, paid our rent. The memories hung between us. For years you said we were a team." Richard's jaw tightened. "Until the moment you believed you didn't need me anymore." The silence stretched. Finally, Richard spoke again. "What do you want?" The question sounded exhausted. Not angry, not defensive, just tired. I considered it. Then answered honestly, "Nothing." He frowned. "Nothing? You already gave me what I needed." Richard shook his head. $600 billion. His voice cracked. "You didn't need revenge. Maybe not. But I needed closure." The word seemed to confuse him. Closure. "Yes." I looked at the courthouse behind him. "For 7 years, I wondered if you loved me. Or if you loved the life we were building." Richard looked away. "When you handed me that $5,000 check, you answered the question." The street noise faded into the background. Reporters kept shouting. Cameras kept flashing. But the moment between us felt strangely quiet. Richard exhaled slowly, then asked the question he had been avoiding all day. "What happens to me now?" I didn't answer immediately, because the truth wasn't simple. Your firm will face investigation. The bank collapse will trigger audits. Your investors will likely walk away. Richard nodded weakly. He already knew that. And the SEC? He asked quietly. I looked at him carefully. That depends on the evidence. His shoulders dropped. Prison. The word hung in the air. Maybe, I said honestly, or maybe not. Richard studied my face, trying to read something. Anything. Then he asked one final question. Why are you still standing here talking to me? You could leave. You already won. I glanced toward the Maybach, then back at him. Because there's one more thing you need to understand. Richard waited. The reporters leaned closer. Cameras still rolling. I stepped toward him slightly. 7 years ago, you fell in love with a woman who worked quietly in a restoration archive. A woman who believed loyalty mattered more than money. Richard's eyes softened slightly. That woman still exists. But she learned something important. Power doesn't change people. It reveals them. I held his gaze. And Richard, you revealed exactly who you were. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself, because there was nothing left to say. After a moment, he stepped back. Then another step, as if creating distance from the life he had just lost. Finally, he spoke. Goodbye, Stella. Goodbye, Richard. He turned and walked down the sidewalk. No security, no investors, no fiancé. Just a man disappearing into the crowd. I watched him go. Then my driver opened the car door again. Madam Chairwoman. I nodded. But before getting into the car, I turned toward the reporters. Hundreds of cameras lifted instantly. One reporter shouted the question everyone wanted answered. Chairwoman Morgan, do you have any comment about Richard Caldwell? I paused for a moment, then gave the only answer that mattered. Sometimes the most expensive mistake a person can make is underestimating the quiet one in the room. Then I stepped into the car. The door closed. The Maybach pulled away, and for the first time in 7 years, my life finally belonged to me again. But the real ending of this story didn't happen that day. It happened 6 months later, when a letter arrived on my desk with Richard Caldwell's name on it, and what he wrote inside completely surprised me. 6 months after Richard Caldwell lost his fortune, his company, and the life he believed he deserved, a single handwritten letter arrived at my office. Not an email, not a legal notice, just a plain envelope with my name written carefully across the front. And what he wrote inside surprised me more than anything that had happened during the divorce. Because the man who wrote that letter was not the same man who had laughed while handing me a $5,000 check. If you've ever watched someone lose everything and finally understand why, you'll know why I read that letter 3 times before putting it down. My office overlooked the San Francisco Bay. Floor-to-ceiling glass framed the skyline. Cargo ships moved slowly through the morning fog. The headquarters of Aegis Global occupied the top floors of the building. For the past 6 months, my life had been filled with meetings, acquisitions, and restructuring projects. Running a trillion-dollar trust meant making decisions that affected entire industries, data centers, energy grids, artificial intelligence infrastructure. But that morning, the most unexpected thing on my desk wasn't a financial report. It was a letter. Mr. Sterling stood near the door as I opened it. It arrived through standard mail channels, Madam Chairwoman. He spoke carefully. Security cleared it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Richard Caldwell. I unfolded the paper slowly. The first line stopped me immediately. Stella, I'm not writing this letter to ask for anything. Mr. Sterling quietly left the room, giving me privacy. The letter continued. I'm writing because 6 months ago, I lost everything. And for the first time in my life, I had no one left to blame except myself. I leaned back in my chair. The handwriting looked uneven, not the confident strokes of a venture capitalist signing contracts, more like someone who had rewritten the letter several times. I kept reading. The investigation into Caldwell Venture Partners is still ongoing. The SEC froze most of my assets while they review the records. I already knew that. Our legal department monitored the case closely. But the next line caught my attention. Jamal accepted a plea deal last month. 3 years in federal prison. I paused. Jamal Harris, the loudest voice in the room 6 months earlier, had vanished from the financial world almost overnight. The letter continued. For the first few weeks after the divorce hearing, I hated you. I hated the court. I hated the bank collapse. I hated the investors who abandoned me. But mostly, I hated myself for signing that waiver agreement. My eyes moved slowly across the page. Then something changed in the tone of his writing. But after the anger faded, something else happened. Silence. For the first time in years, I wasn't surrounded by people telling me I was brilliant. No investors, no partners, no press interviews, just quiet. And in that quiet, I started remembering things I had ignored. The small apartment we shared, the nights you stayed awake editing my thesis, the way you used to leave coffee for me before my morning classes. The letter paused there, like the memory itself had slowed his writing. I realized something during those months. I didn't build my life alone. You built it with me. And when success finally came, I decided I deserved all the credit. I set the paper down briefly. The office felt unusually quiet. Outside the window, the fog had begun to lift from the bay. I picked the letter up again. There was a line written slightly darker than the rest, probably pressed harder into the page. You asked me one question in the courtroom that day. If our positions were reversed, would I have helped you? The answer is no. And that's the part that finally broke me. My chest tightened slightly because I remembered the moment clearly. Richard had never answered the question. Now he had. The letter continued. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to help me. You gave me more than enough chances during our marriage. I just wanted you to know something. Losing the money hurt. Losing the company hurt. But realizing the kind of person I had become, that hurt more than anything else. The final paragraph was shorter, simple. I hope your life is everything you wanted it to be. You deserve that. Richard. I slowly folded the letter. For several minutes, I didn't move. 6 months earlier, Richard Caldwell had been the loudest man in every room. Confident, arrogant, certain the world belonged to him. Now he was writing quiet letters from a small rented apartment, while federal lawyers examined his company's records. Power had revealed who he really was, exactly like I had told him. A soft knock came at the office door. Mr. Sterling stepped inside. The board meeting begins in 20 minutes. I nodded, then looked once more at the envelope. What would you like done with it? He asked. Most executives would have thrown it away, closed the chapter, moved on, but I didn't. Instead, I placed the letter inside the top drawer of my desk. Archive it. Mr. Sterling raised an eyebrow slightly. For legal records? No. I closed the drawer. For memory. He nodded, then turned to leave. But before the door closed, I asked one final question. Mr. Sterling. Yes, madam. Has the SEC finished reviewing Caldwell Venture Partners' case? Not yet, he answered. But early indications suggest Mr. Caldwell may avoid criminal charges. Civil penalties are more likely. I nodded slowly, which meant Richard might eventually rebuild something. Not the empire he once imagined, but a life. After Mr. Sterling left, I stood and walked toward the window. The sun had finally broken through the fog. Ships moved slowly across the bay. The world continued forward, just like it always does. And as I looked out across the city, I realized something unexpected. My story with Richard Caldwell had finally ended. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with a letter and the quiet understanding that sometimes losing everything is the only way a person learns who they really are. But there was still one final chapter left in this story, because a year after the divorce, I saw Richard Caldwell again, and what he was doing shocked everyone who knew him. 1 year after Richard Caldwell lost his fortune, his company, and the life he once believed he deserved, I saw him again. Not at a courthouse, not at a gala, not at a billionaire's investment summit. I saw him in a place no one from Silicon Valley's elite would ever expect. And what he was doing there changed the way I remembered our entire story. If you've ever met someone years after a life-shattering mistake and realized they're no longer the same person, you'll understand why that moment stayed with me long after it happened. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon in San Francisco. Fog drifted lazily between the buildings. The city felt slower than usual. I had just finished a board meeting at Aegis Global's headquarters and decided to walk through one of the older neighborhoods nearby. No security convoy, no formal schedule, just a rare moment of quiet. Sometimes running a trillion-dollar trust means forgetting what ordinary life looks like. I walked past bookstores, cafes, and small shops lining the street. Then something caught my attention. A small community center near the corner. Old brick building. Hand-painted sign above the door. Free financial workshop for small business owners. Inside, a group of about 20 people sat in folding chairs. Local shop owners, freelancers, young entrepreneurs. And standing at the front of the room, writing numbers on a whiteboard, was Richard. For a moment, I thought I was mistaken, but it was him. Same height, same posture, but everything else had changed. No designer suit, no luxury watch, just a simple button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He was explaining something carefully to the group. Cash flow is more important than revenue. His voice sounded calmer, less sharp. A bakery owner raised her hand. What do you mean? Richard drew 2 columns on the board. You can sell a lot of products and still go bankrupt if your expenses come due before your income arrives. Several people nodded. He kept explaining, patiently, clearly. The same man who once managed venture capital deals, now teaching small shop owners how not to collapse under debt. I stood quietly near the doorway, listening. Richard never noticed me at first. He was focused on the room, helping a restaurant owner understand loan terms, helping a freelance designer calculate taxes, helping. After about 20 minutes, the workshop ended. People thanked him as they packed their bags. One older man shook Richard's hand. Richard smiled modestly. Banks make money when people don't understand the system. The room slowly emptied. Then Richard finally looked toward the doorway and saw me, not with panic. Not with embarrassment, just surprise. Stella, his voice sounded calm. Looks like you changed careers. He rubbed the back of his neck slightly, something like that. The room was quiet now. Only the hum of an old air conditioner filled the silence. You teach free classes? I asked. He nodded. 3 nights a week. Why? He leaned against the table. Because a year ago, I realized something embarrassing. What's that? I spent most of my career helping wealthy investors make more money. But I never helped ordinary people avoid losing theirs. I studied him carefully. He looked different. Not broken, just grounded. The SEC case finished last month, he said. Civil penalties, no prison. I nodded. I heard. My company's analysts followed the case. He chuckled quietly. Of course they did. He glanced around the empty room. Turns out, when you lose everything, you have a lot of time to think about what actually matters. Silence settled again. Then he asked something unexpected. Did you ever read the letter I sent? Yes, I answered. Richard nodded slowly. I meant every word. I know. Another pause. He looked at me carefully. How's the empire? Busy. $1 trillion problems tend to keep people occupied. He smiled faintly. I believe it. Then he gestured toward the whiteboard behind him. You know something strange? What? Teaching these classes feels more meaningful than half the investment deals I used to close. I tilted my head slightly. Why? Because when a billionaire makes another $1 million, nothing changes. But when a small business owner avoids bankruptcy, their whole life changes. His voice carried quiet conviction. I studied him for a moment longer. The arrogant venture capitalist I had divorced felt like a different person. Maybe he was. People rarely change without losing something first. Sometimes they have to lose everything. Richard finally broke the silence. I'm glad you're doing well. You deserve it. I nodded. And I'm glad you found something worth doing. He smiled slightly. Life's strange. A year ago, we were destroying each other in court. Now we're having a normal conversation in a community center. I walked toward the door. Before leaving, I paused. Richard. He looked up. You once asked me why I stayed and talked to you outside the courthouse. He nodded. Because closure matters, I reminded him. And today feels like the final piece. Richard looked thoughtful, then nodded slowly. Yeah. I think it is. I stepped outside. The fog had lifted completely now. Sunlight filled the street. Behind me, through the window, I could see Richard erasing numbers from the whiteboard, preparing the room for the next group. A quiet life, a smaller life, but maybe a better one. As I walked away, I realized something important about the story that had once consumed both of us. Revenge may start the ending, but growth is what truly finishes it. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who walks away with everything that truly matters.